right? Number one, consider the following class definition. Which of the following is a true statement about the behavior word class objects? Well, as you can see here, the answer is going to be B. Every time a word class object is created, the max word variable is referenced, which we can see in our constructor right here. In our constructor right there, we can see that the max word value is going to be referenced actually twice there. So that we know is the correct answer, but if we want to talk about why some of the other answers are not correct, we can. So word class objects can change the value of the variable word more than once. So this is incorrect because it can only change word once. All right. C says every time that an object is created, the value of max word changes. And this is incorrect because it's only going to happen if that is true. So it won't happen every time, more than likely. Part D says that no two word class objects can have their word length equal to the length of max word. This is not correct because if it is the max word, then it's going to be equal to it. And that's okay. And we can create another object that is the exact same. That's totally okay. All right, and last one says the value of the max word variable can't be changed once it has been initialized. This is very true for word because of the word final here. So word can never change once it's been initialized, but max word can change if it needs to and if it wants to. So final only means that word can't change. Question 2 here, we have C as our correct answer. So if I look down to my code down here, right? So we're going to start by constructing something. So then if I look at my code at this first line of code, we'll call it line 1 and line 2. Line 1 is going to take my count variable. Right there. It's going to initially start at 0, and then it's going to add 5 to it first. So line 1 is going to take count and add 5. And then we do something.increment. And we can see here that we have our count plus plus. So that is going to then add 1 to it. So therefore C is our correct answer. The code segment creates a something object S. The class something static variable count is initially 0. Right there. And then it's increased by 5. Right there. And then it's increased by 1 right there. And question 3 here. So our correct answer is E. So we have our code right here. And we want to know, actually it's right there. Which of the following best describes the behavior of the code segment? So if I look at my loop's going to run 5 times. And we're going to have int k is going to be some random number. When I times it by 10, add 1, and then cast it as an int, that's going to give me a random number between 1 and 10, inclusive. And then I want to know if that random number that we just created is greater than or equal to element.maxValue, then we're going to create a new element there. So as I look at my answer choices, obviously E is the correct answer here, because between 1 and 5 element objects are created. And the reason C is not the correct answer is because we know one element for sure will be created. So if you notice, the only difference between those two answer choices are that number there. Because max value starts at 0, and we're creating a random number from 1 to 10. So we're for sure going to do at least one element. But we don't know exactly how many elements because it all depends on what our random number happens to be. So really good thing, if you see math.random, you're almost never going to have an answer choice that says exactly. Because obviously math.random is random. So to say you're going to have exactly something is usually not going to be the case. And so yeah, and we have 1 to 5 element objects are created, and then element.maxValue is increased for at least one object created. All right, and last but not least, we have our student class. So we always start out the class with the header public class student. We have any type of global variables that will work for everything, also called instance variables. And notice that these are usually, the variables are always going to be private, usually going to be private, and that the methods and constructors will then be public, as we'll see here as we go. All right, when I start making a class, I'm always going to start with the first line of code here, the public class student. I'm then going to write my default constructor, but I'm going to leave it blank, and then I'm going to move down to my actual constructor. So when I start this, I'm only going to write that first line of code, that second line of code, and that third line of code. And then I'm going to follow my directions. So the directions say create a class called student. The constructor should have 2 arguments. So I need to know that there should be 2 things here. It says it should have first name and last name. So those are both going to be strings. So I'm going to call it string F and string L. Now the thing here is that when we have these arguments, they only exist inside the brackets. So F and L are only going to exist as variables between these lines of code. So at that point, I know that I need to use these variables someplace else in this class. So that's when I'm then going to go back up here and do this line. Just trying to do these 2 lines of code. So now I've created this information in these 2 lines of code where I can take whatever this data is and use it in the rest of my class by using it to this variable. So we're assigning kind of where that information should go and how I'm going to be able to use it throughout the rest of my class. So first equals F, last equals L. So now I can use first and last throughout my entire code. All right, continuing on with directions. It says the default constructor should use the word this. So that tells me I'm going to say this, and then it sets both names to unknown. And what basically it says is that I'm going to call this with this information. And I know that's a lot of this words that I just used, but basically what it's going to do is it's going to run this line of code and then run this line of code. And what's going to happen here is it's going to jump down to this line of code then. And it's going to call student, which we just had here, but instead of student with nothing in it, it's going to put this in it, in the parenthesis, which then matches up with a first name and a last name. So it's just something that's going to call another constructor in my class. The directions then say the toString method should return the info as seen as the sample run. So we'll get to that in just a second. I'm going to skip that right now. But then it says create another method called getStudentID that returns it. We're going to come back to that. It says lastly, the district ID 834 should also be assigned and printed with each student. So the district ID here is then that's going to tell me, oh, I need to create another variable. And I'm going to create this variable here. And because it says district ID is 834, and this number will never change, means that I can make it final, and I know that that's a good way to make this so that that district ID is never going to change. Just note it's good coding practice that variables that are final are capitalized. So that is usually a clue. It doesn't have to be that way, it's just kind of how we code that as good grammar for code. All right. So we finished that, but notice we haven't really talked about the student ID at all. So on the second page of your directions, here's the sample run and some information about the student ID. So it says the student ID starts at 100,000, so 10000. It's going to increase by 123 each time. So the student ID brings me to my last 2 pieces of information here. we're going to have a student ID that's going to start at 100,000, and then our variable here. Now, because every time we create a new student, it has to increase, that tells us that we're going to be creating a static variable here. So num is going to keep track of that information. So num is going to be static, and then the student ID is going to be just the variable that's going to hold the student ID information. But num's going to keep track to make sure each student ID is different. So then every time we create a new student, num is going to increase by 123. And then we're going to assign whatever that num is. We're going to assign that to student ID so that that student now has a student ID that is different and unique. All right, so now as I go to my toString method, notice we can do this two different ways, right? We're never going to print, so system.out.print anything in the toString method. We're always going to return a string. So we can do this kind of two different ways. You can do this in one line of code if you want to, but the easiest way is just to create a string. So I said string print equals and then empty, and then to start adding everything that should get added to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the name of the person. So right, name colon and then last name comma first name. Once again, notice those variables are last and first. They're not L and F. If you put L and F there, you're going to get an error. Then we're going to add the student ID. So once again, I do the new line, and then we add the student ID, and we do a new line, and we add the district ID here. And then I just return that variable. And it's going to return it in the 3 different lines of text there to look like our sample run. And the very last thing, it said to create a getStudent ID method. That's just going to return student ID. So remember, student ID is going to be an int. So it has to say public int getStudent ID. And then we just return whatever that information is. So we're going to return that student ID. And that is how we create a student.